Welcome to Proles of the Roundtable.
Hello and welcome to Proles of the Roundtable, where we sit down, have a few drinks, and talk leftist history. Please do us a favor and like and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Rate and review to help extend our reach. Before we get started, we wanted to thank our sponsor, without whom we wouldn't have these lovely, beautiful, wonderful microphones. That sponsor is Halliburton. In addition, we would also like to thank our Patreon contributors, without whom we wouldn't have these USB cables?
Sure.
I don't know. Anyway, Bennett Morris, Danny, our filthy comrade, Ewan Simpson, who is presumably a clean and orderly comrade, Johnny, Bolshi, Nathan Bullock, and RK drank a beer once. All of these people are heroes of the revolution, and they make it so much easier for us to do this podcast. Thank you. If you would like to join our Discord chat, suggest an episode, do any sort of really cool, amazing, great things that we offer, early access. Dialectics After Dark, that's a Patreon exclusive episode of Proles of the Roundtable. Then head on over to patreon.com/ProlesPod and give us money. There's no upper limit. So, as we suggested in Dialectics After Dark, if the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, victims of communism, anybody wants any sort of propaganda that they want, Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, like if anybody, comrades, please donate to our Patreon. Anyway.
It all goes right back into the pod.
It goes right back into the pod. We'll buy much better than the shitty microphones we have now.
Sorry, Halliburton.
Sorry, Halliburton. So, tonight, with us, we have Justin. What are you drinking?
Tonight I have from Breckenridge Brewery Hop Peak IPA.
Ezra, what you got?
Peach Pear LaCroix.
LaCroix.
Stop. Hyder is our guest of honor this evening. What are you drinking, Hyder?
I'm drinking water and Nitrotech protein.
Nitrotech protein. I don't know what that is.
It's a protein shake.
And I'm Jeremy. I'm drinking Tsingtao, the people's beer, of course. I don't have one in front of me. Justin, beer me.
Sure.
What's going on? Comrades help comrades. So I suppose I wanted to give a little background on Hyder. I work in a writing center as a tutor, and I do a lot of really, really annoying evaluations of the same essay over and over and over and over, dealing with rhetorical analysis. And ethos, I've been told, is a very important component in rhetorical analysis. So, the credentials of the person who's going to be speaking tonight. Hyder is Iraqi. Grew up in council estates in West London, which, for those American listeners, it's housing projects, basically. You pulled yourself up by your bootstraps.
It always works.
And now you have a PhD.
Yeah.
That's wild.
It's absolutely useless. But I have one, yeah.
Well done. So I suppose, what are you going to discuss this evening?
Well, my interests in Iraq are sort of twofold. One of them is personal. I mean, I'm an Iraqi. I lived in England, the country that blew the shit out of one of the countries that blew the shit out of my country. So there was always that aspect that was very personal. But the other aspect has been my research into Iraq. I've been doing fieldwork in Iraq since 2005. I've done over 6 years in Iraq. field work. I'm the only field worker who in Iraq outside of the Green Zone and the Kurdish protected zones, though there are all of a sudden 2 or 3 new people doing that. And there really just wasn't anybody keeping a record of what was happening to Iraq while the USA was tearing it to pieces. So, if nothing else, I was just trying to maintain a sort of record of what was going on between 2003 and today.
All right, so I guess where do you want to begin?
I mean that's a tough one. But before we get into all the depressing stuff, maybe we should say a few good things. There are a few amazing things in Iraq still. Well, I mean, not a lot, but there are still a few good things in Iraq. I mean, the level of destruction that Iraq has lived through since the 80s, but especially since 1990, is preposterous. But one thing that Iraq has always had is an incredible musical tradition. And just very briefly, because this always is overlooked, this aspect of Iraq. When Bach, really is inventing sort of modern music, right? Harmonies and all that good stuff that will dominate the Western tradition, till today. At the same time, in Iraq, the maqam is invented. And the maqam has really 2 very different senses. One is a musical repertoire, and then also a musical tradition. And that musical tradition extends from Morocco all the way to China, in that straight line. And whereas the Western tradition will privilege harmonies and this sort of mathematical model of what music should look like, the maqam, the Iraqi maqam, it's modern all the way through, but people always call it traditional. It's born in the same period as Bach. It privileges microtonality, improvisation, highly structured repertoires which allow for improvisation. So high structure, but the emphasis is always on improvisation. And though you get a singer who's not called a singer, he's called a reader. You don't sing the maqam, you read the maqam. That tradition really just until the last 10-12 years was the thing that united the whole of Iraq. Every Thursday evening, so Thursday evening would be the equivalent of Friday evening in the West, right? The weekend, right? But we only had one day off, it was Friday. Now it's a 2-day weekend. But they would start at 7 p.m. in every single town and city, coffee shops, bars. They would have a reader of the maqam, and it would last for 12 hours. They would have to go through the whole repertoire. And just think about, and the same, there's a maqam for women as well, right? So the men would go, and then the women had their own, but the women would be at home. The maqam would be at home, right? And just think about, a kind of people who needed this.
Right.
I mean, it tells you that there was something very interesting about them. That went, Saddam, reintroduced it in his nationalistic project, but the maqam is a very, very special aspect of Iraq, and Iraqis unfortunately don't know it, most of them. They don't have that understanding, but before it used to be part of the lexicon of how you speak about life. They would refer, because everyone understood the maqam, every move in a song had a name to it, and that's how they would talk to one another. So I grew up with the Iraqi emigres, especially the Iraqi Jews who left in the 50s. That's how they spoke. So when I went back to Iraq, nobody understood this language. Nobody understood this. That was a bit heartbreaking. And I'll tell you a little funny story. So I'm obsessed with the maqam. And every time I talk to Iraqis about it in Iraq, they always laugh at me, particularly anyone younger than 60 or 70. They think I'm preposterous. But 2005, when I first arrived in Iraq, I go to Baghdad and I say, listen, boys, where can I get CDs of my favorite maqam singers? Yusuf Omar, Gulbenchi, Rashid al-Bandarchi, all of these guys. I was like, you're crazy, because this was a time when everyone was getting killed. Nobody was leaving their home. Anyway, so I start speaking to taxi drivers, and anyway, this one guy says, look, you have to go to this part of Baghdad, and you have to go upstairs, and you have to knock on the door, and sometimes I'll open, and sometimes they won't. And this is just an indication of what happened in 2000, after 2003. So I go upstairs. It was near Kurh in Baghdad. Anyway, so I go up there, I knock on the door, and I get shouted at from behind the door, get lost, get out of here. And I was like, what? And I keep knocking. I was like, I just let me
I
in.
really want this music.
Anyway, he opens the door, and it's a PKC. I don't know what, you know, the one, those machine guns that are tied to the back of. You know, the big ones with the
like
with the
50
9
caliber.
mm. Yeah. And he was pointing at me. I was like, what on earth is going on? He said, man, we've had 3 grenades in the last week. So,
Wow.
so that, I mean, that's really the collapse. If you want to, yeah.
Catch a bullet before you catch some culture.
But I became close friends with that security guard. I would hang out with him for hours on end. But yeah, it did get me in trouble, my interest in the maqam. Oh, and the other thing was when ISIS started their war against Iraq, there was a place where Yusuf Omar used to play, one of the big maqam players. He was a murderer and also a very famous paedophile, but he was amazing at it, the maqam. So he learned to become a maqam singer in prison. 7 years. He just would replay it and he perfected it. Anyway, so I have this affinity for Yusuf Omar. So I wanna go to the hall where he used to play in Baghdad, the famous one, and I take a picture. Long story short, I end up in a prison cell. And I get the crap kicked out of me for at least 12 healthy hours.
Wow.
Until they find out that I do know a few people. And then they kick the crap out of me for not telling them sooner. And then I'm let go.
Wow.
So yeah, those were good times. I've got in trouble for the maqam. But anyway, there's just that
I've
one.
suffered for the maqam.
I have suffered for the maqam. Yeah.
All right, cool.
So I guess your interest in Iraq is obviously like personal.
Yeah.
But beyond that,
Well, yeah. So for me, let me just very briefly tell you sort of how my interest, what shaped my focus in Iraq. When I returned to Iraq in 2005, my focus was all on Saddam Hussein, quite frankly. See how he had destroyed the country, how Baathism had completely changed Iraqi society for the worse, how many people were imprisoned and tortured. The mass project of de-intellectualization that took place under the Baathists. That really was because don't forget, we left in the 80s. So I always have this, you always know when an Iraqi left Iraq by what they're complaining about in Iraq, right? So
how old were you?
Well, I mean, when we left, I was like 6 months old.
Okay.
Little baby.
7 months. Yeah, I was a little baby. But I mean, in London.
Was this literally your first time back then?
Well, yeah. I couldn't go back because I would have had to have been conscripted, and my father was and mother were on the list of people who had to be executed. So, so if I weren't going back, the very least that would have happened is
they were on the list because they were communists.
Well, I mean,
your father was.
Well, but by that, so my father in 1976 was caught by the intelligence services, and as many communists had to do, he had to sign that. You never have been, and you never were in the past, and you never will be a member. And if you didn't sign it, you'd be executed.
Yeah,
you don't have a choice. So once he signed that, he was in a lot of trouble. Yeah. But
is this all like left over from Qasim, or is there something else going on there?
I mean,
why was there this anti-communist like?
Well, I mean, so 70s. I mean, they. So I don't know if you. So the communist part of the Communist Party joined the Baathists, and really, what it turned out is that in a senior committee of the Communist Party, there were Baathists, double agents, and the reason why they wanted to unite the communists with the Baathists is so they can hand over the list of member of communists, and then just take care of them one by one. So by the mid to late 70s, they'd really taken care of the communist issue, and then the Iranian revolutions happened 79. But by 77, the focus was all on Islamic groups. Muhsin al-Hakim is a very important figure, a filthy, horrific creature. But so what's interesting is that the Shiite. So Muhsin al-Hakim was what Sistani is today, the Marja' al-Dini. He's the head of the Shiite world, right?
Right.
Muhsin al-Hakim, like a beggar, was in the street in the 50s collecting money to go kill communists, right? and they would work with the Ba'athists to go kill the communists. But the majority of the communists were peasant Shiites.
Wow.
You know?
Yeah.
But this is the battle that everyone always forgets. This is why the Shiite clergy will always it's like Al Qaeda, right? They're always going to be temporary, right? Because their problem is once they get power, they're too selfish, and they believe in this idea that all money and the bodies of Shiites belong to them, right? And the Shiites already got rid of them in the 50s and 60s. They've already had enough of them. But this 2 generations later, everyone forgets and they return. But now, if you see the demonstrations in the south of Iraq right now, mass demonstrations for 3 months, all against Iran and against the clergy, Shiites, and the government's calling them Ba'athists. It's interesting, yeah. So there's always been that complicated relationship where if the Shiites weren't with the clergy elites who were the mass landowners, right? They were the lords, the Shiites were the serfs, right? That's why you get this huge migration under Abd al-Karim Qasim in the 50s from the south. It was them running away from serfdom, right? And they took living in shanty towns over what they were living under before. So Muhsin al-Haq, so the Shiites work with the Ba'athists indirectly and sometimes directly. And then in the 1970s, Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, a very, very important Shiite figure who, in some sense, he wrote 2 books, Iqtisadina wa Falsafatana, Our Economy and Our Philosophy. He was trying to write this. This is a very important guy, believe me. So he wrote these 2 books which were direct challenges to communism. He was saying that that Shiite Islam could offer another model of existence based on the Quran, but also dealing with, class inequality, what the economy should be like, and what have you. So, but he goes and is killed by the clergy elite. They go and inform on him to the Ba'athists to get him killed. So there's a complicated relationship between the Shiite clergy, Ba'athists against communists. Everybody was against the communists. They were highly educated. They were highly respected. They would go into villages. Doctors would go there. They would help people for free. There was. We would say in Iraq, Herbe, there was this. People looked up to the communists, right? But the problem was also that Iraq was horrifically divided along not just class lines, but so minutely divided. Like an engineer would only hang out with other engineers because of the naqabat, the unions. They would go to dinner only in there, and then the doctors would only hang out with the doctors. That excluded the majority of Iraqi society, right? And they would pay a price for it. Right. They would pay a heavy price for it. So,
what do you feel like it is about that? Like, why segment so much?
You have to understand the change was so quick and so radical. Like from
the Ba'athists?
No, from the 1940s to Abd al-Karim Qasim, right? So in the 1940s, you have about 5,000 people, 10,000 people working for the government, right? Small elites, kind of like, this sort of bureaucratic, right? Yeah. And many of them trained abroad, or they went to Baghdad or Cairo. They were seen as, of a different class. But when Abd al-Karim Qasim comes in 58, and actually maybe the 5-10 years before that, there's a lot spent on education.
Yeah.
And that helped. So you've got, I know one guy, my father's age, he was a peasant. He lived in a shanty town, and he went and studied in Leningrad.
Wow.
Physics. And then he finished his PhD, and then he did his postdoctoral work at Warwick in the 60s and 70s. I mean, that was... So what you had was people who literally grew up in shanty towns, but then were forced into this model, this ideal of the Western professional. And so there was a lot of self-loathing, a tremendous amount of self-loathing. And people would cut off ties with their family. There's an amazing TV show that came out in the 70s, Musa Taht al-Hallaq, where he was showing this Saddam Hussein in the 70s. The elderly a lot of them couldn't read and write still. So he was forcing them to learn how to read and write. So the show was about all these different aspects of Iraqi society, from Kurd, Turkoman to Shiite peasant, and they all had them in this one room, and it's a horror show. But that's Iraq, right? It was this microcosm of what life was in Iraq, right?
Wow.
So it was technocratic. It's very different from Syria. Syria was already highly sophisticated. They'd had the French there.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, the British, when they come to Iraq in 1917, they come because they're broke.
Yeah.
And they're like, we can't spend a penny. We just want to extract.
Right.
And Iraq is like, you need to spend some money. And they're like, this doesn't work for us.
Sorry, bro.
Yeah.
I didn't bring my wallet.
So Iraq never had that experience. The Ottomans also had no interest in Iraq whatsoever. They were very extractive. Their interest was in the Mediterranean and in Central Asia.
Mm-hmm.
They had no interest in the Persian Gulf. So Iraq never had that experience. Baghdad a little bit. Mosul more than anybody. That's why Mosul still today is like always going to be the most sophisticated intellectual. But I'm translating these words from Arabic into English.
Yeah.
I don't. These are the kind of ways that people speak. Muthaqqifin, they're cultured. People in Mosul. But that's why people think people from Mosul are very arrogant. But they have that Ottoman. I mean, the Mosul souk market was massive. It was second only to Aleppo in terms of in terms of the Arabian countries. It's huge. And obviously, as I'm sure a lot of people know, that it was probably a mistake to tie Mosul in with Iraq. Mosul has much family ties, tribal ties with modern-day Aleppo and that part of Syria and parts of Jordan. So when I was in Aleppo, like in 2008, 9, 10, 11, they're talking about Mosul as if they live there. People literally were ready to die to go protect Mosul.
Yeah.
So, which for them meant Iraq.
Right.
But the connection was that deep. And Mosul was
But
never...
it was for context, like I don't know how much people know about the history of the Middle East prior to the U.S. bombing it to shit. The Middle East was carved up by the British and French following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and so this was not done in a logical way. It was not done in a way in which cultural, religious, whatever groups were put together. People who had relationships with each other were split in half, and so Iraq was carved into the shape it is now, purely to serve the interests of the French and British, and for no other purpose. So,
well, I mean, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which Lenin was the Fadaha, I don't know what the word is in English now, I'm thinking Arabic. He's the one who exposed it in 1917, right? I mean, those two lunatics just sat with a ruler and pencil.
Yes.
And it was like, see you later, guys.
Patted each other on the back.
Yeah, so if you look at the map of the Middle East, that literally is like an afternoon, evening's work between them.
Just two bros fucking around with a map.
Yikes. Deciding the fates of millions of people.
I mean, still dealing
All
with
right, so
fallout.
I guess moving forward.
Yeah,
because you said you wanted to go sort of with modern history, and then work your way backwards.
Yeah, well, when it's necessary.
Sure.
So for me, the sanctions era is a fascinating insight into the way in which the new form that American imperialism takes. And I say it's American, and I always get in trouble for this when I say it's American, but in the Oil for Food program that the United Nations instituted, that Iraq was able to sell about $2 billion maximum dollars worth of oil per year, but the United Nations themselves would procure, the basic necessities that Iraq need, which was wheat, rice, and other such staples. So the Oil for Food program. So if Iraq ever wanted anything, right? So just a simple thing, like if Iraq, it needed tires for its lorries to be able to distribute food across the country, because it was under a rationing system, because Iraq, at its best, from 1991 till 1995, could only provide 1,400 calories per person per day under the rationing system, which wasn't enough. And nobody was earning more than $2-3 a month if they worked for the government, which was the majority. of Iraqis, and the private market was selling, kilos of apples for thousands and thousands of Iraqi dinars, which was just 1 kilo could sometimes be somebody's monthly wage. So so in order for the Saddam regime, I can't believe I used the word regime. I feel like I'm on CNN. the Saddam government.
You are a CIA agent.
Donate to our Patreon.
So the Saddam government, as it was trying to distribute food, like one of the things it needs tires. It needs spare parts for its lorries to be able to distribute. So it would have to apply to a UN committee, right? Right now, Iraq put forward about 100,000 requests. So I mean, like really simple, basic stuff. We're not talking missiles. We're not talking bombs or anything like that.
Yeah.
We're talking about like nuts and bolts, simple nuts and bolts for specific. They would have to put it through the committee, and the committee only meant sometimes once every 3 months, or sometimes once every 6 months, depending on their relationship with Iraq. And even then, they would put holds on it. Holds meant they would stop it and block it for sometimes a year, 2 years. Sometimes after that period, they just say no.
Yeah.
But of the holds, 11,683 holds, only 11 of them were not by America.
Wow.
And 10 of those were by the English. And the French didn't want to feel left out, so they put one hold in. Right?
Yeah.
But so it's an American phenomenon, right? It's not a phenomenon of the UN. Nobody else is putting these holds on them. But let's work our way back just very, very quickly to 1990. 1988, 89, Iraq had come out of the longest war of the 20th century with Iran, right?
Yeah.
And it devastated Iraq. Iran dragged out the war for as long as it possibly could. The Iranian Revolution wasn't going the way they thought it was going to go.
Yeah.
And Iran was just much bigger, was able to sustain itself through a war much easier than Iraq was able to. And Iraq became very dependent on the Gulf states. Saddam thought he was going to come out of it as a hero, as this great Arab leader who defeated the old enemy, the Ajam, which is an insulting way to refer to the Iranians. But of course, as soon as he came out of the war, Saudi Arabia supplied food, had supplied weapons, so had Kuwait. In fact, the relations between Iraq and the Gulf nations was very, very good. But when he came out of it, of course, the Saudis were saying, listen, this is only a loan. Right? Which, by the way, it was our fault. It was Iraq's fault. Saddam had this Arab feel like, your word and my word. Dude, you need contracts, you need... Yeah. This was his problem with Iran, the 1975 Algeria Accords, which is what the war between Iraq was about. Saddam just thought, listen, I'll give Iran a bit of land and everything will be all right. And then a few years later, he's like, this isn't such a great deal for us. So he was a bit goofy and he was a bit arbitrary, old Saddam. But so when he came out of the war, by the way, what the Gulf Arab states did to Iraq is exactly what the USA did to the UK after the Second World War. Exactly.
Lots of loans and extraction.
Well, but the British didn't think they were loans. They sent John Maynard Keynes after the Second World War as if they were sending the Queen.
Sure.
It was like the Economist, right?
Yeah.
And they sent him to Congress. Listen, talk to the Americans. Tell them to write it all off. We won. Let's move on. Congress was like, get the hell out of here, you little... Yeah. So that was the same thing that happened to Iraq. And then Saddam turned on the Gulf states. It would cost us terribly in the long run. But the Gulf states were, I think, the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the USA, but I think the USA was really convinced by this chap called Bender, who was, do people know who this, you ever come across?
Probably not. No.
Have you ever come across him?
I don't think so.
Oh my God, Bender. Oh my, can I give you a very quick run of Bender?
Yeah.
This is, oh my dearie me, this guy. He was the Saudi ambassador in America, right?
Okay.
And this guy, there's a picture of him sat with George Bush Sr. is sat on his chair, and Bender is sat on the desk, like hanging over him, like telling him what to do, sort of stuff, right? Bender goes all the way back to the Carter administration. He's the one with Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had this great
The
idea.
Carter regime, I think.
The Carter regime, the Carter prison camp, yeah. They had this great idea of funding Osama bin Laden and his pals, using Islamic terrorism as a sort of political weapon. So Bender goes that far back, and his connections with Congress and the Senate were incredible. So just very briefly, because even though I was quite young, I still remember like day by day what went on during the 19. And the Americans had no interest in a war against Iraq at all. I mean, I still remember it. It was September, there was no talk. October, there was no talk. By December 1990, things were completely different. And it was Bender. It was Bender who really was pushing for, listen, you have to go after Iraq. Why? Why go after Iraq? Because their great fear was that the Iranian Revolution would get to Iraq. They wanted a buffer. This is a very old idea. This is a Cold War idea of you keep Iraq ablaze, so you attract all the worst elements of the region, and that will be your buffer between the Arab world and the Persian world, right? So, as we know what happened, the Americans were sold on the idea. And by the way, don't forget, George Bush was called the wimp president. I think that got to him.
He was like, I'll show them.
Well, he tried to show them with that invasion of Grenada. When he killed like 98 people.
Jesus.
And that wasn't enough. People always laugh about Trump, but if you remember your history, they're much goofier presidents than
Recency bias.
Recency bias, yeah.
So anyway, when the war takes place against Iraq in 1991, it's a very short war, January to March. Anyway, the State Department reports the numbers anything between 4,000 and 20,000 dead, which is about the most ridiculous thing you could ever imagine. Because just one part of the war, the famous motorway of death, right? A retreating Iraqi army that had surrendered, that highway are bombed to smithereen by A-10 tank busters, right? And it was, the scene reported by Iraqi soldiers who were there, it was a scene like no other scene they'd ever seen before. And don't forget, they were in the Iran-Iraq war. They fought, they'd seen awesome battles, the Battle of Fao, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers on each side battling it out. They'd seen awful things, but what the Americans did to a retreating Iraqi army, which was unarmed, was incredible. That then spurred the first Intifada, the first uprising against. And the uprising was, we've just come out of an 8-year war with Iran. We're exhausted, and now we've just gone through this.
Yeah.
Right? Now, this bit is one of my absolute favorite bits, and you'll get a nice little insight into the thinking of the way the Americans work. Schwarzkopf and his troops, they take a bootleg left. They miss all the major cities. They go through the desert, and they're running up all the way to Baghdad. Right?
Storming Norman,
right?
Storming Norman.
So he's about 50 kilometers outside of Baghdad. He can just take it, right?
Yeah.
And he's told not to. Don't do it.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, Saddam, at that exact moment, is fighting against an uprising, which, bear in mind, was an uprising which started in Basra, Saad Square in Basra, and a lot of people were killed. In Karbala alone, 50 to 60,000 people in a space of 3 or 4 days.
Jesus.
But before that happened, okay, there's a story that gets sold to Iraqis that this is Iranian backed.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So what does that do? That spooks a lot of Sunni Iraqis.
Yeah.
It spooks a lot of them, right?
What's Iranian backed? The
uprising.
The uprising.
uprising. Okay.
Right? They're very good. The Baathists are very good at selling a story. And listen, just to be completely fair, okay, there are people who fought in the Intifada who still see it as this beautiful moment, who do admit there was Iranian forces, there were Iranian agents that were participating in it, particularly in Najaf and Karbala. So, this is just a nice little moment. So while this is going on, the Iraqis, bear in mind, you've got the no-fly zone, they're not allowed to fly. If anything goes up in the air, the Americans straight away shoot it down, right?
Yeah.
So, they want to sign the peace
By our
accord.
father.
He bombed. He didn't.
No,
He was
no,
not a dogfighter.
No, I know, but
Yeah.
So when so what happens is they want to sign the peace accords because the Americans are super worried about a Shiite takeover of Iraq. That's their huge paranoia, and the English, right? So when they come to sign the peace accord, the uprising is taking place, right? It started off in Basra, then it swelled to all the major cities and towns in the south of Iraq and in the center of Iraq, right? Now, they sign the peace accord. The peace accords are, no, you're not allowed, you can't fly anything, you can't have any missiles that shoot further than 50 miles, as in, you can kill your own people, just don't kill your neighbors,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So all of that is going on. Saddam Hussein says, look, I'll sign everything, right? I just need one condition, right? I want you to change one aspect. I'm allowed to fly helicopters, which in the peace accord is like there's a fancy term for it, non-stationary winged flying thing. I forgot I mean, it's an absurd, but it meant helicopters, right?
Yeah.
And why was it he wanted to be able to fly his helicopters? So he could be able to bomb, because he had Apaches, he had Russian fighter helicopters, and as soon the Americans agreed to it, knowing exactly what he's going to do with it, which is, so as soon as they the peace accords are signed, Saddam goes in and in Karbala alone, the women and children ran into it's not a mosque, it's the holy shrine for the Imam Hussein, very important figure, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, who was martyred fighting the Umayyads. They go in and hide there in their thousands.
This is a quick aside.
Go on.
Was that the prophet that you were talking, or the figure that you were talking about? That's the split between the Sunni and the Shia.
Yeah, that's
right?
the split. That's the fitna, the fancy Arabic.
I studied the Iran and the Iranian Revolution, and I remember that, and so I was just trying to make sure I was.
Yeah, so the fitna, the split in the Islamic world, takes place in Karbala, in Iraq, the great battle. Anyway, so they go into the shrines in Najaf, in Karbala, and they fly their helicopters. They bomb the hell out of it. It starts off with tank fire because they allowed tank fire. They tanks them, and there's Hussein Kamel. There's a famous apocryphal story probably where he says, "You're Hussein and I'm Hussein. Let's see who wins." Right? Anyway, so it was very clear from the peace accords that the Americans wanted Saddam to stay. Right?
Yeah.
They saw him. This is the only way you can understand the sanctions. It was not a punishment against Saddam Hussein. It was much more an attack against the Iraqi people directly, because that's what they were worried about. They were worried about a popular Shiite uprising, which would make Iran much stronger.
Sure.
That's how they saw it. They didn't realize, they were not smart enough, God bless their souls, to realize that Iraqi Shi'ism is at war with Iranian Shi'ism. There's a huge battle between Qom in Iran, who now claim to be the rightful leaders of the Shiite world, who have a completely different philosophy. Most people have heard Wilayat al-Faqih, the
You overestimate American education.
well, okay. So one of the things that people try and scare people about Iran is that their Shiite leaders work this idea of Wilayat al-Faqih, which is the world of the jurisprudence, right? And that in this idea of the Wilayat al-Faqih, the Islamic Shiite jurisprudence are the ones who must be protected. That all Shiites must fight to the death to protect the Wilayat al-Faqih. Now, Iraqi Shi'ism does not have Wilayat al-Faqih. It doesn't have that idea at all. And Iraqi Shi'ism is a much more cultural form of Shiaism as well. It's had a much longer history. Shah Abbas turns Iran into a Shiite state in the 17th century. So it's much newer, and it's much more tied to the Persian system of understanding how authority should work. So anyway, they never knew that. They didn't understand it was that.
Or did they? And they were just pushing for this narrative that serves the needs of the U.S.
You have to remember,
policy.
I've worked with the Americans a lot. You know, particularly when I was in Iraq, and then when I came to the USA, I was going to DC a lot. They don't know, and they don't care. The whole point is like, we've got a massive army. We don't need to know. We can do and I always say to them, look, at least the British, you know, they had the Foreign Commonwealth Office. Now the Foreign Commonwealth Office used to be the Foreign Office, but at least they created universities like SOAS where you had linguistic training and quote unquote cultural training. So at least you knew what you were doing when you were killing these people, right? Have the decency to know, you know, who you're killing, right?
Them. Yeah.
You know, that's the good thing about these English
Shake
gentlemen.
their hand first.
Yeah, right. Right.
Make them tea.
But so when I spoke to people in DC about this, they say, look, we leave it to the market, and they really said, they keep saying this.
Jesus,
we leave it to the market. I was like, dude, but Harvard is a joke on Iraq.
Yeah.
Like the people who they have as Iraq specialists are just people they want to have dinner with, like Dexter Filkins, who was the senior editor of the New York Times, who now just did an HBO special. I mean, that's how much this guy knows about Iraq. I mean, this guy's living in his mind.
Yeah.
So, but they were like, listen, it's the market. If the market needs it, it will produce it. Clearly, the market doesn't need it. So you'd be very surprised how ill-informed they are. But I guess it's like when you're like the New York Yankees, right? You don't think of the opposition when you're at your best. You're like, we're the New York Yankees. We can blast past anybody. And that's the sort of mentality that you will find in DC. I must say that there was the person I most enjoyed. I don't want to mention his name. Was a hard right-wing conservative. He would be right to the right of John Bolton, right?
Wow.
But this guy was a character. He would, anything he didn't like, he disagreed with, he would go, son, you have a pre-9/11 mentality.
Oh my God. Wow.
So it was ridiculous. It was, you know. So then it became very clear going to DC was a waste of time. This was just, you know, it was just a performance.
Right.
Sure. They are arbitrary. They have no short-term strategy, no long-term strategy. So that's something you have to understand about the Americans. There is no long-term.
They don't understand.
They don't care. Yeah.
They don't understand. They don't care, and they have no plan.
Yeah, they have no
Got
plan.
it.
Yeah.
Right.
And
American foreign policy.
This is in line with what I know,
Yeah.
so
Okay. Yeah.
agreed.
This should be the tagline for American foreign policy. We don't know, we don't care, and we have no plan.
Okay, I mean, just very quickly, I don't know if I'll compare it with the British, right? Because I also, try to work with the Foreign Commonwealth Office, right? Those guys, you would go for a meeting, like you were being mortared, right? Like, you were being mortared, like in this bloody non-hardened accommodation. You were having these meetings, right? And this one barrister, you're waiting for him to come in. And by the way, they were being paid danger money. It's £10,000 a day,
Jesus.
which is what in those days was $16,000 a day, right? And that's not even including what he was getting paid. That was just the danger money, right?
A lawyer, right?
A barrister, which is a fancy lawyer.
Sure.
We have to go through weird
High
rituals.
level, yeah. British law is fucking whack.
So anyway, this clown had to. So the way you get out of like an armored vehicle, right? You actually get trained how to do it, right?
Yeah.
And they can only secure it for 30 seconds or a minute max. So they're like, once we tell you to go, you gotta go, right?
Yeah.
This character's like, listen, there's sand on the ground, and I've got these new shoes. Somebody has to carry me in. No, wait a second. This gets better. Let's get
Holy hell.
because we can now reference Halliburton because
The sponsor,
right?
Sponsor Halliburton.
So they had their own security firm, KBR. I'll actually give you a very depressing story about KBR. KBR, when they after that happened, they sent an email to everyone saying, "We will no longer be carrying our." And the name of the person they have to deliver is the present.
God.
We will no longer be physically carrying presents into the building, right? Anyway, so you'd think you're gonna get some hotshot, right? Who knows stuff? Didn't know squat. There was, I don't want to mention this guy's name. He's at Harvard right now as well. This monobrow idiot who was also a tutor for...
Goes to Harvard, looks at staff, finds a guy with...
I'll give it this.
Google Harvard monobrow idiot.
I don't want to name him because he's such a little nothing. But he was also but you can see it. But you can see how incestuous this world is, right? He was a tutor to Prince William and Prince Harry when he was 18. But he was from the middle classes.
Yeah.
So he grew this monobrow to pretend he's aristocratic. That's my...
That's your theory.
And this idiot...
He put some Rogaine right here in the middle of his forehead.
Glued pubes to his face.
Stop.
Anyway, this absolute clown walks in and he does this annoying English thing of like the Hugh Grant. It's almost like he's about to burp.
Yeah.
And he starts quoting Farsi poetry from the 16th century. Like, what is... And everyone...
what?
And everyone's like, this guy is a genius. He's
a genius.
He said nothing.
Yeah.
Not even Jordan Peterson could reach these levels of nothing, right? And I'm sat there going, what is going on? But this is what Empire looks like. It's preposterous,
I
right?
brought a selection of Farsi poetry and I'm going to read it now.
No, he recited it.
I know.
Yeah. He's also
He's memorized it. That's how you know he knows things.
Well, I mean, just if you read it, he's also the idiot who claimed, he went walkabout in Afghanistan in the late 90s and wrote about it. Anyway, and his first name is Rory. I'll stop there.
Rory.
All right. Okay.
All right, they're
Rory,
narrowing it down. Rory, unibrow, Harvard.
Called out on Proles pod.
And what was interesting, so he's untouchable. When somebody's that vacuous, the establishment just go crazy for him, right?
Yeah.
So there was these senior lawyers from Harvard who I was hanging out with. I was like, is that monobrow idiot still? And they were like, oh God, it's just amazing how much we learned. It's just amazing. Oh. All right, whatever. Well, they made him the bloody governor of Kabul when he was in his 20s. Anyway, okay. All right. Sorry for the long tangents. My apologies.
You good.
That's what we do.
I'm
That's
worse
how
than you
we do.
guys. I thought I'd be more disciplined.
Yeah, no, you're lying. Yeah, you're lying to yourself.
Yep.
You don't even have any beer.
No.
Nah, you want a beer?
Go on, yeah.
You're talking about it,
I
right?
guess if we're going to. Yeah.
Oh, here we go.
There we go.
Did you bring your pipe?
Yeah.
You brought your Stalin pipe?
Of course I did. Yeah.
Wait.
My pipe is in my bag.
He, in preparation for coming on a Marxist-Leninist podcast, he bought himself a pipe so he could resemble Stalin.
My notes for this: monobrow governor of Kabul.
No, you wouldn't believe these eyebrows. You wouldn't. It's a
I
thing.
can't wait to see them.
Yeah. Anyway, so I mean, I only talk about this because people don't realize how ridiculous. There's a beautiful saying in Farsi. I'm gonna butcher it, right? I never know how to say it correctly. It goes like "Palata titidam, payina titidam," which is to say that we've seen on top, we've seen the top of you, and we've seen underneath you, which is to say like we've seen your asshole, right? And that's the thing with me and like the American Empire, like I know what you look like, like in a way that Americans don't know what they look like.
Sure.
Like I know how goofy you are, right? I know how ridiculous you are, but I can't tell you it ever, right? So I always have to. But you've seen me how I am at university. I'm like blocked away because I can't engage because I know I've seen their assholes. If you know what I mean, like they want to pretend as if they're just heads, But I'm a materialist, So
I've seen your asshole too.
So it's very, very ridiculous. Empire. It's preposterous.
It's true.
Well, because it is like it's cartoonishly evil, but it's also cartoonish.
Yeah,
like it's so awful the things that it does, but it also bungles things half the time.
Well, they're buffoons. I mean, you just meet buffoon on buffoon on buffoon.
It's just a matter of like the unlimited supply of money they can throw at things. So if they fuck it up once, they'll do it right the second time.
Do you want to talk about like how the sanctions came about?
So it comes really out of nowhere, right? because it's not really a strategy the USA had employed directly to destroy a country, right? Normally it was, I mean, the only example really is North Korea, right? North Korea and
Soviet
Cuba.
Union too, didn't they? Well, I mean, but even then they had deals with like the manufacturers and
Yeah.
You're right. You're
Yeah,
right.
I mean, so
Blanket sanctions had not really occurred.
Yeah, but you have to understand, it was, so the only one, so North Korea at least was getting something from China, right? Iraq was completely isolated. And bear in mind, Iraq, unlike all the other countries that had experienced sanctions, Iraq depended on its food. 65% of its food supply were imports.
Yeah.
So the day that you introduce the sanctions is the day people start to die.
Yeah.
Immediately. So 1990, even after the longest war of the 20th century, Iraq comes out with its hospitals, health indicators better than Portugal, better than Spain, almost good as Italy. GDP is beating Portugal and Spain per capita. Literacy levels were in the high 90%. Iraq, the UN the UNESCO in 1983 held Iraq to be the paradigm example of what developing countries should be aiming for, right? Because they weren't just building mass infrastructure in terms of like health projects, but they were also they were focusing on infections. They got their infection rates down lower than many Western European countries were able to get. So
I'm sure lower than the US.
Yeah. So it was.
I mean, if you want to talk about we're talking about the ludicrousness of U.S. empire, and you were talking about how they were lauded in Iraq. Mossadegh was on the cover of Time magazine a year before he was overthrown by the CIA.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean, I don't want to look
cartoonish.
But I mean, let's not paint Saddam Hussein out to be some great guy. I mean, I think this is the mistake we're making with Bashar al-Assad these days in Syria as well, right? I mean, Saddam was using. I mean, he was using the stick and the carrot. The carrot was, look, sure, I control imports. You have to get a license. You can't leave the country without our permission. Yes, we have a murderous internal security police, which was vicious. So that was the stick, and the carrot was, look, I'm Papa Bear. I'll take care of you. You work for the government. And just very, very quickly, this really does begin, even though I love him to death, Abdul Karim Qasim in 1958. Just very quickly, there were only about 5,000 to 10,000 people working for the state before Abdul Karim Qasim comes into power. By the time Abdul Karim Qasim leaves, there's 180,000 people working for the state in 5 short years, and in 5 incredibly tumultuous years. There's coup attempt after coup attempts on his life. Saddam Hussein shot Abdul Karim Qasim in 1959, supported by Jamal Abdel Nasser, which is why I can't stand the guy. I don't know why he's lauded by lefties. He was a shill for the CIA. But anyway, that's
the thing people forget is that the U.S. supported Saddam Hussein to power.
Yeah.
Backed him.
And the British funded, and they are cheap bastards, the English, right?
Yeah.
For them to give money, tells you how much
they like to send their own people to fuck things up. They don't send proxies.
Okay, and just as a quick aside, I was in London in the 1980s, and the Mukhabarat, which was the equivalent of the CIA, they were executing Iraqi political dissidents in London. And the British never said one word. And it wasn't 1, 2, 3, 4, 10. We were terrified.
Yeah.
We were,
because your parents were on a kill list.
Well, it wasn't that. It was like if you said the wrong thing in front of the wrong person.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I now know, in Baghdad, I met the guys who were the agents who were monitoring everything in London. So I sit and hang out with them in Baghdad. They can't go back to Basra. They get killed, right?
Yeah.
So I hang out with them in Baghdad because nobody will speak to them. And we relived the 1980s.
Yeah.
Because I was there and they were there. And I was like, listen, so what information do you have on this guy? And they give me the long file.
Wow. Yeah. That's wild. It's so wild to me that the British government would allow foreign assassins to just show up.
Well, it gets better
and work within their country.
It gets even better than that. The guy who ultimately will get in George Bush's ear about an invasion to Iraq is Kenan Mikayer. Kenan Mikayer wrote this, I think, brilliant book, Republic of Iraq. And he'd finished it by the late 70s, early 80s. And it was really about the story of how the Ba'athists, how they failed to get power in 63. They're the ones who killed Qasim. It was their coup, but somehow the Arab nationalists came in, Abdussalam Arif, and then his brother Abdul Rahman Arif. So the Ba'athists had that 5 years to think about, like, how did we lose power?
Yeah.
And when they said, next time we come into power, it won't be public executions, which we're going to show on TV. It will be private. It will be hidden. And the party will have its own intelligence services, and then we will take over we'll build up and take control of the intelligence services in Iraq. And it was East Germany. They went to East Germany particularly, and Russia, the Soviet Union, to be trained. But anyway, that's fine.
This is fine.
Yeah.
We're all fine.
Anyway, so Kenan Mikayer writes his book Republic of Iraq, and this guy he's such a shill. He doesn't have a PhD or anything. He writes his book in 1991 called Cruelty and Silence, which is him sticking two fingers up at Edward Said, saying everything that happens in the Middle East is the Arabs' fault. That's 1991.
Wow.
But before, and that's when he gets his job at Brandeis, which he just now retired Professor Emeritus. Like, when a guy sells out the Middle East, they really reward you.
They love it.
But what was interesting, he wrote Republic of Iraq. No academic press would publish it because the Americans and the British wouldn't allow it to publish.
Wow.
Which tells you how intimate the connection is between, like, imperialism and academic publishing houses.
Yeah.
They only allow the book to be published in 1986 when they're like, wait a sec, this is after the Noriega, the Iran-Contra affair and what have you, where the tides were already shifting.
Yeah.
Right? So that's how intimately tied, like, empire and academia is, right? But anyway, that was just a aside. They don't have a problem with executions on their own land, generally speaking. They quite admire it. But anyway, so
I love it.
Back to the sanctions. So the war happens. Saddam annihilates the Shiite uprising. It became known as a Shiite uprising. And then you have Camp Rafah, which I just need to say something quickly about. Tens and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis end up in this camp in Saudi Arabia called Rafah, and the levels of abuse were just extraordinary. I mean, it only gets closed in 1998, 99.
Is this a prison camp?
It's a refugee camp. It's meant to be a refugee camp, right? But the Saudis every day would go in, they'd smash the tents down, they'd set it alight, they're beating people up.
Why? To what end?
Because don't think they want to neuter Iraq, but they're still with Saddam. They still see these guys as Shiite, as sellouts, as Iranians, and what have you. But anyway, that's Camp Rafah. Anyway, so let's now talk about the sanctions. So the sanctions were meant to be temporary, right? They weren't meant to be this long-term strategy, this long-term plan. First thing that happens is you go from a modern, highly sophisticated country which is completely embedded in the global system. It is reliant on its exports and its imports. This was the whole point, right? Iraq broke out of its being a rogue state from Abdul Karim Qasim. It's integrated into the world system for the first time, really, by the 1970s. And Iraq is dependent on on the global system. And in one day, it's completely cut off, right? Now,
when was this exactly?
1990 in January. Okay. No, 1990 in September.
Okay.
1990 in September. So the first phase of the sanctions is between 1990 September to 1991. First thing we see is the complete collapse of the Iraqi dinar, right? Now, the Iraqi dinar, Saddam had overvalued it. It put a lot of gold and currency behind it so that Iraqis would get a discount from their imports, a bit like the Americans with the
Sure.
petrodollar. So it used to be the Iraqi dinar was one Iraqi dinar $3, right?
Yeah.
Well, that by the Iran-Iraq war, it reached 7 dinars to $1. That was about as bad as it got. And then by 1990, we were already in 800 Iraqi dinars for
Jesus.
$1. It was just, and then Saddam had to start printing. He started having to print, and he ran out of paper, so he had to print on bad paper as well. So that phase, morbidity and mortality shoot right up.
Yeah.
But where does it happen? Right, it happens mainly with the elderly, but especially infant mortality. This is the big story of the Iraq sanctions. Infant mortality. Now the State Department in 1993, 94 as well had a corrective to what the Iraqi figures were. Iraq was claiming that by that time at least 250,000 infants had died because of the sanctions. The Americans come back, listen, we think it's no worse than 2,300 infants a month, right? Right, but if you go, I mean, you still near the 100,000 range, right? And they're like, well, we're okay with it. Madeleine Albright, and we're okay with it, right? So even if you go by the State Department, right, it's still a horror story, right?
Sanctions are war crimes.
Well, it's also going back to the English and the Irish famine. It's an induced famine, which is not, and this is why the numbers are. It's easy to sort of pettifog, right, with the numbers, because when you induce a famine, which no doubt that it was by any standard of famine. There's a 1997 definition of famine that is classic. It would easily apply to Iraq. But the thing about famine is you don't just die of starvation like the Irish famine. You die of disease. You die of consumption. You become much more vulnerable.
Because you can't get the nutrition that your body needs to fucking function.
Yeah. So that story, for instance, of famine and the rise of diseases is no better encapsulated than a story of Iraqi Bacter, which is something that, if it wasn't for the American soldiers who had been infected by this, nobody would ever believe the Iraqi story about what happened to them. So I'm going to talk to you quickly about Iraq Bacter, right? So when the sanctions happen, all medicines are blocked. All medicines are blocked. I'm talking paracetamol. I'm talking ibuprofen. By 1993, they only allow, you can have paracetamol, you can have ibuprofen, there's one other painkiller, and we're not talking codeine, right?
Right.
And now, imagine, Iraq now is the most cancerous society in the world, right? Iraq has 2 cancer treating centers, chemotherapy centers, one in Baghdad, one in Mosul, right? You need radium for this to function, right? It has to be replaced, right? You cannot use radium to make a bomb out of. You can't use radium to make weapons out of, right? They deny Iraq radium, right? The most cancerous country in the world, right? So if by 1998 you would have to put a patient under chemotherapy for 2-3 hours under this one machine, right? In the most cancerous society in the world, right? You were just going to die, and you didn't have painkillers.
Right, and at this point, they're not only do they not have medication, but they're basically bankrupt, right? Because of the inflation rate.
But you can't buy it anyway. Where are you going to buy it?
Right.
You're not allowed to import it, right? So then the only other medications you're allowed are certain broad spectrum antibiotics, right? This is one of the great health disasters of the 20th century, because what then happens is you show up with a simple lung infection, right? A chest infection, right? You need amoxicillin, right? There's no amoxicillin, right? So what do they give you? They give you a broad spectrum antibiotic which kills everything, right, in your body, right? But it's not that effective against a chest infection. So guess what happens? It morphs and it changes, right?
Yeah.
They become resistant, right? So who get to these diseases? The American soldiers. And it's only in if it wasn't for the American soldiers who kept dying
Right.
from this, nobody would believe that it exists. Iraq Bacter. Now, where do we see the impact of Iraq Bacter? We see it in the war in Syria. Iraqi fighters going to fight with Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon and Syrian fighters, right? In the same explosion, right? When a Syrian gets shrapnel, when a Hezbollah fighter gets shrapnel, they can treat it like that. The Iraqi dies.
Wow.
It's amazing, isn't it? Like, they're like, who the hell are these guys? It's just a basic infection. Why
Sure.
are they dying from a basic infection? This is why the sanctions are so crucial to understand, right? What happens after 2003 is not a sect. It is a complete destruction of the state, is a complete destruction of society, and a destruction of the family structure. I'll get into the family structure bit as well. But Iraqi bodies fundamentally changed
Yeah.
during the
The
sanctions. Their bodies like no other bodies. 1,400 calories. The Oil for Food program, when it kicks in 1996, is not only corrupt, they send rotten wheat, rotten rice, and the whole country has to live off it. $200 million worth of wheat is off,
Wow.
and you have to eat that.
And that's what the U.S. did to Poland in the crumbling of the Soviet Union, when they were simultaneously funding the Polish resistance solidarity movement through Radio Free Europe, which was funded by the CIA.
Sure.
But they were sending to Poland to quote unquote assist them. They were sending them computer and manufacturing parts that were intentionally bugged and defective
Yeah.
in order to collapse their economy,
Yeah,
while
yeah.
they're simultaneously funding the
Yeah.
resistance
Yeah.
to then overthrow that economy that was
But
already
that's they did the same thing to the fucking Soviet Union. Like there was a technological exchange that took place.
I'm
And
just
they-
using Poland because they didn't fund the resistance in
Right,
Russia
in
in the
the
Soviet,
Soviet
Union.
Union.
Yeah. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so like I mean, and look, it's important. This you got to tie this up to like the Irish famine, right? Because people don't understand what famine looked like, particularly in the modern era, right?
Right.
Famines
It's
are
happening in Yemen though.
yeah. Famine. What? Yeah, you have these modern states, right? If you attack the state's ability to be part of the global system, you're already in a famine.
Yeah.
That's what people don't understand. You're
Yeah.
already in a state of famine. It's over.
Yeah.
Like,
Sure.
and in order to be able to produce the agricultural infrastructure, you need money. You need steel. You need blah blah blah.
That's why we say that sanctions are war crimes.
Yeah.
Because you can't sustain yourself if you're excluded from the global market. It's over.
Yeah, but let's not even forget, the important thing to forget is that the war starts against Iraq in 1991, right?
Yeah.
1990, 1991. The sanctions is a form of warfare, number one. And even if you want to dispute that, they're bombing Iraq once every 1.5 times a day,
Yeah.
on average.
That was our dad.
Yeah, that was our father. Well, not then. It was later. He was bombing Iraq when we were not at war, quote unquote.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not talking about just one plane flying by itself and dropping. I'm talking about
Yeah.
targeted attacks on Iraq's infrastructure.
Yeah.
Not on Iraq's military infrastructure. They leave that alone.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, there's also the Germans built this...
Well, because they didn't want to attack the military structure. They needed them as a buffer to Iran.
Exactly, yeah.
Sorry, anyway. Go ahead.
But yeah, so anyway, so now I'm gonna start explaining a few things that happened in the sanctions that set up what happened after 2003.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Otherwise we could go on forever.
I
And
mean,
we could.
make a whole episode.
so in there's a place on the Iran-Iraq border called Faylaq. It's a very I have to tell you this thing about the Americans. Okay, by the way, so I have this obsession of reading the right-wing newspapers.
More power to you.
Yeah.
because I like, for instance, I'm an obsessive reader of foreign affairs. I subscribe to foreign policy, right? The amazing thing is people don't realize the stuff they're prepared to talk about, right? So like foreign policy don't like they did this piece, I think it was like 2010 2011, where they went through the declassified communications between the USA and Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war, right? And so Faylaq is one of them. The Iraqi army is just sort of is going straight in, and they don't realize that the Iranians are waiting for them, right? So the Americans send satellite images to the Iraqis saying, "Boys, they're waiting for you."
Yeah.
But why are they telling them that? Go use chemical weapons, right?
Yes.
So what did the Americans do after the chemical weapons were used? They blamed it on Iran.
Sure, yeah.
Right.
And they're like, we had no information, but they knew it was the
We
Iraqi.
sold it to them.
Not only did we sold it to them, they sent them the satellite images 28 times
Yeah.
before Iraq used it. They sent the satellite images of here are the Iranians,
Yeah.
here are the Kurds. Go get them. Now look, there are 5 times where they don't send satellite images. They just go by themselves.
Yeah.
But this is and the dishonesty of the Americans. When the Iranians want to take it to The Hague, the Americans go, "Well, I'm sorry, we don't have any evidence." No, I mean it's dishonesty at level of Trinity. But by 1990, they switched the whole story. Saddam used chemical weapons.
Yes.
Yeah.
With no deficit.
No.
Deficit whatsoever. It's a beautiful system, right?
Just make up whatever the fuck you want to.
Yeah. But anyway, so what happened was Saddam Hussein was fighting Iran. He thought the Shiites were always going to side with the Iranians. He just had this idea. And he was brutally killing Islamic people who worked for Hizb ut-Da'wah.
Saddam was like a secular leader, right? Was he
Sort of. He walked this weird line where he was like he put on a secular face for the secular world, and he put on this like religious
later,
face.
So his problem was so people disagree with me on this, right? So I don't want to say that this is a fact, right? It would take a long time to like properly.
Opinions of our guests are not necessarily the opinions of Proles of the Roundtable.
But what Saddam was selling as a Ba'athist, as a nationalist, was the model of an Arab as a Sunni Arab, right? Sometimes it's named, but it's who he appeals to, right? Yeah. The Abbasids or the Umayyads. So it's a Sunni.
It's an more intellectual. Theoretically, it's a more intellectual form.
So Saddam used to be a part of Qasim's regime.
Never. Hell no.
But wasn't that so? Part of his.
He shot Qasim as a hitman. He was just a hitman.
Would he really?
Yeah.
Okay,
Jamal Abdel Nasser greeted him. Jamal Abdel Nasser debriefed
assassin.
him when he was in Cairo.
Okay. Did he not use the? Did he use the religious angle as a reason for why they need to overthrow Qasim? Because I know that he was. No. Okay.
No. But I mean, Qasim was like the perfect. He was the triumvirate, right? He had a Kurdish Shiite mother. He had a Sunni Arab father. I mean, he had all 3 Shiite
Wahhabist cousin.
So he was like Christ, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost.
Qasim is the shit. He's ugly as fuck.
No, not to me. That's as beautiful as it comes.
Okay.
You need to get your mustache up to his little like pencil mustache.
But I do.
You stand.
I stand.
Qasim.
I mean, and I really do because, like, I love Mossadegh, but Mossadegh was not a communist.
No.
But Qasim was a fucking communist.
Well, he wasn't a communist.
Socialist.
He was a socialist because the communists. I mean, he gave them ministries, but
Right.
I mean, they were a nightmare. They also caused havoc at times. They went to Mosul, caused a massacre. The student union, about 500 people were killed. They're still. That's why anyone from Mosul, generally speaking, are very anti Abdul Qasim.
But my point being that Mossadegh was a nationalist.
Yeah.
He had socialist leanings, but most of his goal was to nationalize the Iranian institutions.
Yeah.
And that was the end of it. Like there was no desire for the publicly owning the means of production or any of these sorts of rhetorical things, whereas Qasim had a much more refined kind of sense of what he wanted to do as far as like his
Well, let me
institution that would also then be thrown over by the CIA.
to give you like the sort of the broader discussion about Qasim, and I definitely don't agree with this, right? But a lot of the people who are against Qasim say he's the one who isolated us globally, because when he nationalized so it was just a straightforward flip. Like 95% of revenue went to the Brits, 5% to the Iraqis, and Qasim just flipped it round.
Yeah,
it was like, you get 5%, we get 95%.
Yeah.
And the Brits were like, wait a sec. Saddam, what are you, big fella? Yeah. But
get in there, bud.
So what a lot of people say, liberal Iraqis, I mean, the idea of a liberal Iraqi is about the most disgusting thing I could ever, but whatever, they exist. Like they'll say, look, we could have had democracy and all that good stuff, and that everything that Qasim implemented were plans that had originated way before in the 30s and 40s. And I'm like, but he implemented it. Anyone can come up with a plan. It's like architects are coming up with plans every day. I've never heard of such a ridiculous argument my whole life.
You know what? 30 years ago, I came up with the idea for the Roomba.
No, but like,
Pay me.
No, but it's like,
I don't know.
It's like, he did it.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
That means something.
Yeah.
Nobody else did it, but whatever. Okay, but
we talked about Baathism. I think it was a couple weeks ago, and you were talking about the difference between Baathism in Iraq and Baathism in Syria, and you were saying that Bashar is seen as more progressive because he instituted land reforms.
Yeah,
and you were like, well, yeah, because in Iraq, Qasim had already done that. Yeah, so Saddam could not institute the land reforms.
I mean, it is. I mean, look, it really irritates me when we get Syria is the leftist Ba'athist and Iraq is the right. But then you just don't know what Ba'athism is.
Well, so I'm gonna like reduce it to the shittiest form. Yeah. Ba'athism is basically authoritarian social democracy, right?
Yeah.
It's like I'm gonna clamp down and give the weakest like capitalist socialist mix possible.
And it's only a planned economy because they want to control it.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't a planned economy because... and look, every time... Look, the Syrian... the intellectual figures that are behind Ba'athism, like in Syria, the big players like Michel Aflaq and these guys, they all have to leave Syria, right?
Yeah.
So Saddam... Iraq was like, we'll take you in, right?
Yeah.
And they're like... Then they start smacking their gums in Iraq, like, what the hell is this crap? And they kick them out, right? It's not... I mean... I know people don't like this idea. It's not. It was never an intellectual project. It was a small group of people in Iraq. I know it beggars belief, but when it happened in '68, the number of Ba'athists there are, it's not that many.
Yeah.
It's not hundreds of thousands. It's a tiny number, very aggressive, very violent. Like Saddam Hussein was a hitman. He left school at 11 years old. He went and shot his uncle. I mean, you're not talking about sophisticates here, right? Yeah. And like Saddam, like the Assad, they fall back on tribal and familial ties, right? To run a whole state.
Yeah.
And so I just always a bit tired of this, like the left wing and right wing Baathism. It's Arab nationalism.
Yeah.
How can we have a left wing nationalism?
I mean, it's left of particular tendencies of Arab nationalism, but it's not. We're not talking about communism or socialism.
No, we're not talking anything like that. But I mean, but there are elements of socialism in there which keep Iraqis happy.
Again, but it is like it's like social democracy.
Exactly.
It's if you had an authoritarian control of the Netherlands. I mean, like that's essentially what we're looking at. A slightly heavier dose of nationalism, but yeah.
Anyway, so back to the sanctions. Well, so you got to go back to the Iran-Iraq war, right? Saddam thinks the Shiites are just always going to side with the Iranians, particularly the south, right? And he says some horrific things. He gets drunk. He gets on TV. He says some of the most absurd things. It's so horrible, but I always find it funny. But you know, I'll get into some of the stuff later. But anyway, but this is really important, right? So there's a Amara, which is the governorate just above Basra, on where the marshes are, right on the east side of Iraq, right, bordering
You are
Iraq.
greatly overestimating American education.
Sorry, guys. So these guys, the guys, the Marsh Arabs, not the people in Amara, people from Amara, where also the Marsh, you know, Arabs.
Men.
They have been unruly to the core. Like they're unruly beyond words, right? Yeah. Saddam Hussein fights this huge war. Then the Maoists end up there. I mean, imagine unruly Arabs and Maoists together. Yes. It's like a show, right? And there was anyway.
Bless.
Anyway, so he's like these lunatics. They're gonna join the Iranians, right? Well, the Iranians break through, and there's no Iraqi army to stop them, and it's Amara. So they just have a free run. The tribes in Amara, like ordinary men, like with Kalashnikov, they're all armed. It's Texas. Sure. Amara's Texas, right? They're all in
Maoist.
Texas.
It's Maoist Texas.
Dude, they're all in Texas. They're all happy. They're so happy in Texas. You've never seen, they're back home. It's guns and shooting.
Hooray.
Right? So anyway, they fight against the Iranian army.
Okay.
And Saddam was like, wait a minute, this happened in 84-5. He goes, wait a minute, these sons of bitches, like, I'm killing them, but they stand up against Iran. No. So what he then does is, because he's running out of money as well, he's like, listen, I'll arm you guys. You guys protect.
This is like fucking like France in the Middle Ages. The France has always had this like bizarre, always had, throughout the feudal period. The king of France was super weak,
right?
And the feudal lords typically had more power, but the gap between where the edge of what is France and what is, whatever it wouldn't have been the Prussians, but I'm too drunk to remember who the fuck was over there. Anybody who was on the border, like with Spain or whatever, would be the Marcher lords, the Marches.
Yeah.
And so even though the king was constantly fucking fighting with his own like feudal lords, he had to arm and fund these assholes because they were his line of defense.
Right.
And that's what it sounds like.
But it was very unexpected to him, right? But remember, at that time, there's only between 60 to 90 tribes registered, right?
Yeah.
Across the whole of Iraq, right?
Yeah.
You have to register. There were meetings with the government, right? Saddam would like to make this show every once in a while of the tribes because he was trying to relive this. He was trying to create this image of Iraq as this eternal Arab state and what have you. But
the ethically constituted histories or whatever.
Right.
Constituted stories.
But bear that in mind, right? Because the tribes, Saddam Hussein can't put up with competing forms of authority.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, he is killing tribes as well.
Sure.
Because, like, listen, I'm the big shot here. I'm the daddy. I can't have other daddies as well, right? So, he was still very into the nuclear family in those days, right? He wasn't a progressive on the cultural front. He wasn't a cultural Marxist.
Stop!
Just would like to point out that Saddam Hussein is the legitimate leader of Iraq because he stands against postmodernism.
But look, keep that in mind, right? So there's only 60 to 90 tribes registered, right, with the Iraqi government, right? Anyway, so the Iran war ends, right? Sanctions start, right? He's got no money. He can't. He's like the American state. He couldn't afford to pay tax collectors to collect the tax. So like one of the things he like starts to do is he says, "Look, we're broke."
Yeah.
So this state, he just had to fire everybody.
Yeah.
He just fire or everyone else quit.
Yeah.
It's like, what's the point? So he starts to delegate like aspects of the state to the tribes, right?
Huh.
And then he says, you can keep a percentage of this stuff, and I'll let you do what you want to do.
The fuck is this? Is feudalism?
Right, but that's what happens when you do sanctions. You take a modern state,
Yeah.
a highly sophisticated modern state. I always say this to my students, and it really upsets them. I was like, I'm an Iraqi from Basra, and I know more than you. How humiliating is that for you as Americans? But I mean, the truth of it, Iraq was a sophisticated intellectual,
Yeah.
and that was the expectation. The expectation was you would be intellectual,
Yeah.
right? So it was an ideal. But anyway, the sanctions happen. Then he's broke. I mean, he is literally having to keep a country alive on about 1 billion a year.
Yeah.
Right? And he can hardly import anything. He can only start to import stuff by 96.
You know what? He should have sold the country to Jeff Bezos.
So
Who was somebody was suggesting selling Greece to Bezos?
I saw. I
the
heard
fuck
that,
is
yeah.
wrong with liberals? Like literally, what the fuck is wrong with them?
They're a disease. There's no cure for cancer and liberals. It's
Sincerely.
So that sets up what happens in the sanctions, right? The tribes aren't this thing. What people don't understand about tribalism is that tribalism is they're very sophisticated and modern. They function in modern capitalistic states. They also function in state breakdown, right? That's always been their story, right? So they start to smuggle stuff. They get stuff in for Saddam. They manage to get cash for him, but they get stronger and stronger. By 1993, 1994, there's 450 tribes registered.
Wow.
Not because they just start inventing them.
Just right. Yeah.
And what do they call them? They call these tribes made in Taiwan or made in China, right? Like these, because they were getting these crappy imports.
Yeah.
China in the 90s was still making crap, right?
Sure.
So they're like, these guys are fake, and they're all over the place, right? So when you hear the story of tribalism in Iraq after 2003, I don't know how much you hear about it, right?
Not a lot. Like there's so much isolation between. Right. I think it serves the interests of imperialism to keep the level of education on a particular area low, because you don't if you don't know anything about this place that is being discussed, and this is the DPRK, this is China, this is the Philippines, this is everywhere. The less you know, the easier it is for someone to tell a lie about it,
right?
Or to tell a half truth, or to pick one particular little detail out and then blow that one detail up and forget everything else.
But that tells you, if you pardon my French, can I use the shit word?
Oh yeah, we fucking curse all the fucking time.
Okay. Look, this is, if you want to know,
a podcast that revolves around getting wasted and talking about history, and you're going to ask if you can pardon your French.
Look. So this is an insight into how much the English are as pieces of shit.
I thought you were going to start speaking French.
No. The English are the great shits of human history.
Yes.
Because they know.
Yes.
They're in the countries. They know, and they still do it. You know the old, forgive them for they know not what they do, right? Forgive them for they know what they do.
Yeah. No, I mean that's
a different empire.
We could do a whole episode on the British, but the British are fucking horrific because they spend so much time getting to know someone, so that they know how to fuck them the hardest.
But dude, the populations, you have to understand, the populations were in Rhodesia, we're in India, we're in. Do you know how many British people, when like the war was going on in 1990, would come? Like, I would go to exhibitions for like cheap housing, or even as a kid, because like Iraq needs this, right? And I would be a 14-year-old, I'd be skipping school, going to these business exhibitions, right? Because I'm like, people are dying. Can we find cheap housing and what have you? And they were like, I'd go up to people and I'd start talking to these companies, and I was like, listen, where are you? Like, which country? I was like, Iraq. They would come and hug me. It's like, Jesus, it was the best years of my life. Baghdad. I was in the 80s, right? The English don't have the excuse. I'm going to take this to a very weird place for 2 minutes. To a guy called Conor McGregor, right? Do you know? Has anyone heard of Conor McGregor? Conor McGregor is now the biggest fighter in the world. He's a MMA.
Oh, yeah.
He's a mixed martial art fighter, right?
Sounds like the host of the Late Late Show or something.
Right. So he is.
He's an MMA fighter, isn't he?
Yeah.
Conor McGregor.
Yeah,
I think literally he is.
Yeah,
There's
right.
a Conor McGregor.
He's an MMA fighter. I think he's like even like more like followers than LeBron. Like I think he's the number one sportsman in the world, and if he's not, he's in the top 5 or in the world, right? He's gonna fight Khabib Nurmagomedov, who's from Dagestan, Russia, right? Both Conor McGregor and Khabib have close relationship with Putin, right? So they had the press conference for this fight, right? Khabib has never lost a fight, right? The Lenin created a martial art of Sambo. Khabib is the world champion of it, right? And he's going to take on this Irish boxer, essentially a boxer, right? It's going to be this great fight. So they had the press conference, right? And Conor McGregor called Khabib's father, pardon my French, a pussy for not killing Kadyrov of Chechnya when he had the chance, right? Which, I mean, so for me, like, first of all, who the hell mentions Kadyrov, right?
Yeah.
So I'm laughing my ass off, right?
Yeah.
I turn to like my American MMA guys who know all about this stuff. He goes, "Yeah, we're Americans, man. We're not into all that. We don't know who this Kadyrov." He just accused somebody of being a wimp for not stabbing one of the worst dictators in the world to death. So, I mean, the disconnect between the world is unreal. America has.
For sure.
It was the funniest thing I'd ever heard. I mean, you don't have to have a PhD to find that funny. Anyway, whatever. So I hear what you're saying.
I think Justin mentioned this before we started recording. In order to be a communist, you have to know everything about everything. You have to know the histories of every communist and vaguely socialist nation in the history of time. You have to know terms. You have to know theory. You have to know what happened to this person.
You can empirically defend the Soviet Union and Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela and
but also
Iraq and China and North Korea, and then somebody would be like, "But what about Tito?"
Exactly.
And then you'd
That's
be like,
exactly.
"I don't really know
anything
about
about
Tito."
Tito.
And they're like, "Checkmate, loser."
No, that is. I've lived this since I was a kid.
Yeah.
It's horrific. Like when you do well, you do well. What about Namibia in the 50s? Oh,
I
you
don't
son of
fucking
a.
know anything. But that's the thing. Like you have to know everything.
The worst thing is,
if you're a liberal, all you have to do is be like Stalin, and that's it. And that's it.
Or why do we have to hate each other? Why can't we just get along?
Coexist.
Yeah.
Coexist.
No, man. The worst one was, do you know, because I remember the old style commies, right? The little lunatics. They'd always have like 10,000 cigarettes. And then they're like you, actually, Jeremy. You remind me of the old stuff.
What?
Then they start going through the archaeological record. Like, come on, man. Give me a break. Do you remember what the old commies used to be like? They always used to talk about, well, what about the pre-Babylonian modes of production? Like, gee, give me a break, dude. Enough. It's too much.
It's history.
Yeah. So I lived it. It's
I love it.
I hate it. You're a nightmare, Jeremy. I'm not kidding.
I will credit you. You haven't called me a little prick once in this, during this recording. It's like I think you called me a little prick twice in like the hour and a half we hung out earlier today.
Yeah.
Ecological determinism, you little prick.
Okay, so
Moving on.
So one of the big stories of 2003, after 2003, is what people call traditional Iraq. The tribes are not traditional. There's nothing traditional about Iraqi tribes. They are utterly modern. They completely fit in with modern states, but they're parasites, right? So what they do now is, if you want to dig an oil well, right, they'll just show up and they'll be like, we're going to close the whole thing down until you give us lots of cash.
Yeah.
The Chinese have to deal with, every company that has come to Iraq has had to deal with this nonsense, right?
You mean the social imperialists?
The social imperial. So that starts really in the sanctions. The rise of tribalism. There are hints of it in the Iran-Iraq war. Saddam turns to them. But when the state collapses, he has no money. He then starts to delegate aspects of this. And you have to understand, everything that happens in Iraq is about the state and collapse. Because Iraq we were completely enthralled by the state. We didn't know anything outside of the state, you know.
So when does he start delegating to the tribes?
Well, I told you, the big insight for him was that battle with Iran where they spontaneously stand up. So he arms them.
The Marcher Lords.
Yeah. So he arms them. He arms some of them in Amara and Kut on the borders of Iran between 85 86. I mean, he's still killing them as well. You know, I mean, I'm not worried about that. He's not letting anybody down. But
he's staying on brand.
But by the time the sanctions come in, the state had collapsed. So he's delegating that. They become part of the state apparatus, right?
Sure.
That's why you can't get rid of them. He made them part of the state, and he had to. I mean, there was no other option. I don't know what the other options would have been. He had no cash, right? So what you start to get is the gangsterization of Iraq, right?
Yeah. The
gangsterization of Iraq, and Saddam Hussein amazingly allows a TV show to come out on Iraqi national TV, the Bil-Lir, the Wolves of the Night, about the rise of the gangs in Iraq and how they're stealing from people, killing, prostitution really takes off. Look, prostitution has always been in Iraq, and it's always been relatively public, and by public I mean everybody knew about it.
Sure.
And the women were not seen as these awful beings.
Sure.
In fact, the first hospital that is built in Iraq in 1924 is a clinic for prostitutes in Shara al-Rashid in Baghdad. So, to deal with sexual infected diseases. 1924.
Sure.
Come on. This isn't the British. The British are scandalized by this.
Yeah.
Right? So, but anyway, but it's the gangsterization. Like, there was a famous pimp in Baghdad who died in 1976, and all the prostitutes who worked under them, who were in the many tens, right?
Yeah.
They were wailing in the streets. They did a long march and parade for them. And people knew the pimp. He was respected. They liked him.
Yeah.
He was a character. His two sons, his two sons. They own a restaurant, and he had their sons. Their mother was a prostitute, right?
Yeah.
They have a restaurant. I eat there all the time. I mean, I never talk about it, right?
Sure.
But I know, like, they know I know, and
but
like, it's normal. Like, imagine here in the USA that kind of life.
Yeah.
You wouldn't. It's not possible,
Sure.
right? Anyway.
But as I understand it, in these Arab countries, sexuality is very repressed.
Well, I mean, it is. I mean, it's not. It's different, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not. I mean, I'll be honest. I've never even made out in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I have no idea what the hell you're meant to do. I have no idea what game looks like in Iraq. And like the Iraqis.
But you have had a fucking machine gun in your chest for trying to listen to some music.
No, but people don't understand what field work is like for me. Iraq.
Maybe I should suggest to Adam Leach at the Leach Pit that he has a machine gun on his door. Just in case. Just in case.
You never know.
For the shoplifters.
Yeah, I mean, that part I never really figured out. And I was fine not to figure it out, quite frankly. Because I think I would have had to have got married, which was not something I was into, quite frankly. But I had 7 years, mate. 7 of my best years. Nothing. No, nobody thinks about that. By the way, what Western anthropologist is going out doing even 6 months without having a jolly up, right? What is it? The anthropologist, you haven't done real field work if you haven't fornicated with a local, right?
Oh my god!
I'm like,
that's the most terrible thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, but does like fornicating with myself count? Because that's as close as I've got, right? But anyway, by the by, it is what it is. Nobody thinks about that. Nobody thinks about that.
7 years?
7 of my best years.
Peak performance hider. 7 years. Wasted.
I think about it every day. Like, could I have done more good?
Oh, God.
Anyway, so you've got the rise of tribalism, right? Okay.
Shifting gears,
right? Then now we have to go back to the Iranianization of Iraqi society. Like, I know it sounds pretty. I don't know what the word is. Like, yeah, I sound like one of those bad guys, right? Bloody Iranians are taking over, right?
Sure.
You know, but the Iranians bloody took over, and like this is what some of the ways they did it. So when the passage out of Iraq when we left was 82, 83, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the passage not a lot of people had left by then, right? And leaving was dangerous.
Sure.
Because if you're caught, I mean, you're done for, son. So, and then, you know, my father gets the call from a friend who works in internal secret police. He's like, listen, big fella, you got about half an hour before they come to you, and that's it. It was literally half an hour, right? And my father was wealthy. Like, he wasn't allowed to work for the government because they would have to check his past.
Yeah.
So he played this weird game of like, the Ba'athist would be like, why aren't you registered in Baghdad? He goes, because I'm registered in Basra.
Yeah.
And then in Basra, he had to escape Basra. Anyway, that's not interesting. But anyway,
it's kind of interesting.
So what he did was he chose to live in an apartment with a guy who had the same name as him, but who was a senior Ba'athist.
Okay.
So when they came asking for my father, they were like, no, that's where that guy, you can't mess with him, right? That was the only way he could. But anyway, so he got this call, like, you got half an hour. And like, he had to collect some cash, put in a black bin liner, and we left. Like, it was like 10 minutes, whatever. And all the other money was stolen by everybody else, you know. Yeah. And he was a contractor. They stole his cranes, his bulldozers, his shops, everything went. Fair enough. I mean, people
that's
died.
Why you're an anarcho-capitalist.
No, but I don't get upset about it because people died. I mean, we lost something. You know, we at least we were alive. But I mean, it's painful when I walk down, I see, you know, whatever. So I'm only telling you about this because the only route then was because we were like they said, at least we're Shiite, so maybe Iran would protect us.
Yeah.
But the route was you had to go up north to the Kurdish part of Iraq, right? The Kurds, the Peshmerga, were at war with the Iraqi army. That's why he gassed them, right?
Yeah.
So if you get caught by the Kurds, you're dead.
Right.
If you get caught by the Iraqis, you're dead, right? We got kidnapped for a day and a half by the Kurds in the mountains. And the mountains are extremely high. The Zagros Mountains, they are ridiculously high. 5,000 meters, 6,000 meters. My mother's terrified of heights, same here, but I was too young. My sister as well. And the mountains are sheer like that. And the only way you can like navigate them is through the baghal. You know, when a donkey and a horse mate, a mule. Is it a mule? Mm-hmm. That's the only thing that can... Anyway, so you get into Iran, and I'm only telling you this because once you get to Iran, you get put into a refugee camp, right? What had happened was that the Shiite political groups that had run away from Iraq, they had organized their own groups within the refugee camps, right? And they were working with the Iranian state. So when we came in, they essentially tortured my father and mother to give up information about the Iraqi army. And my mum and dad was like, to hell with that. We're not helping the Iranians kill Iraqis. We're trying to get out of this, right? So the Iranians worked very, very closely with these organizations from the 70s. And that's why when you talk about the Hashid, right, it's the political parties that were organizing it, like Hadi al-Amri. Hadi al-Amri was in Iran from the 80s, early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. He was working with the Iranians he's as Iranian as he comes. Like, when you talk about Hadi al-Amri, you're talking about Iran, as with most of these groups, right? Apart from the Sadrists, who sometimes have a good relationship with Iran, sometimes not. But the Sadrists were essentially anti-Iranian, right? So every Shiite organized group in Iraq, apart from Sadrists, but they're too ridiculous, like, to be predictable, and you know. But all of them were based in Iran, in London. If you wanted to meet these organizations, their offices were in the Iranian consulate. They were in the Iranian consulate. I mean, how much more Iranian do you want to get?
Sure.
Right? So when 2003 happens, that little miserable, motherless son of a Hakim, the Hakim family, those turds reproduce, right? And what happens is you have Muharram. Muharram is the most important celebration for the Shiites. It's a 10-day mourning of the prophet, the battle in Karbala, the fitna, the split. Each one of the major figures that is martyred in that battle, they get 1 day. So it's 10 days of crying and beating yourself up silly and eating amazing food. Big shout out to Qima, man. The Najafis, I can't stand you little lunatics. But I love you. But I love your Qima. I love your Qima. The reason why nobody likes the Najafis, we call them Ghassal Mortar. They're washers of the dead. It's the largest morgue in the world, Robert Berry. And it's a business. And they're the worst people I've ever met. God bless them. Horrible. So anyway, best pickles though. Shout out to the pickles as well. That's the only reason we go.
People, great pickles.
Really great pickles, and not Abu Ali the shop. Everyone says Abu Ali. You gotta go through you gotta go somewhere else to get
Full
it.
support for pickles.
Dude, can I tell you about these are dead best, right? Wait, I'm bloody salivating already. So you buy a dead bet. You buy a dead bet, which is what do you call it? Like a tank. I can't speak English when I think in Arabic. You know, what do you call it? A big jar, but it's like a jar.
An urn?
It's like a barrel, but they make it into a smaller thing. It's plastic nowadays. In the old days, it used to be. You open, right?
Yeah.
And you eat that on the way home. That's done. And your stomach is in agony.
Yeah.
Just this acidic. But it's made from dates. So it's sweet and sour. I'm literally salivating. Yeah. Anyway, that's the only reason we go. I swear to God, it's the only reason I go to Najaf. It's and because of the Imam Ali.
So we're going to take a cultural exchange trip to Najaf to
Eat some fucking pickles.
eat some pickles.
But it's very so this is just a very quick aside, right? So when you go on a pilgrimage, right?
It's been about 1,000 of these.
I know. What
really
are you
quick
going to
asides.
do? Okay, so you go to a pilgrimage. You have to go to the father. The Imam Ali is the third Khalifa, the third leader of the Islamic, the fourth leader of the Islamic, the fourth and last, right? So he's buried in Najaf. So he's the father, right? So if you do a pilgrimage, you have to go to Najaf first. You can't go to Karbala because that's where his son is buried, right? But you go there, do it quickly. You have the pickles, and you get the hell out of there, right? And some people like dahiniya, which is this dessert made of animal fat, which is way too intense for me to even try. So I'm like, sorry, boys. But then you get to Karbala, and that is just... You know, okay, so Saddam Hussein... No, okay. No, you want to know how weird a place this...
Remember at the beginning of this, and you were like, I'm not going to get derailed. Like,
no, but this is back to this goes back to the sanctions and the... So, you remember I told you that the Karbala gets bombed to smithereens, right?
Yeah.
Karbala was a medieval town, right? So it was all nooks and cranny khans, these wooden houses.
It's like the shambles of York.
Yeah, so it was just, anyway, it was very magical. I never got to see it, right? But anyway, so once they tore it to pieces, the governor of Karbala, a militant Ba'athi, Sunni, completely rebuilt it quickly. Because, like, after you kill people, you're like, all right, let's give you a nice town, right?
Yeah.
So people...
Consolation prize.
So people always, like, remember him very fondly as a... It wasn't always just murder and pillage with the... I'm just trying to say that.
Yeah.
So, anyways, it's a beautiful experience going to Karbala. But anyway, so we're talking about the tribes. Next we need to talk about sectarianism, right? So, the sectarianism story, part of it is a geographical... Okay, you need to understand that the problem in Iraq is way more class than sectarian, right? So the Baghdadi Shiites from the forever elite wealthy families, the names of these families are very, very well known. They're extremely well. I mean, we're talking tens of billions, some of them, right? Hundreds of millions at the worst, right? That's the poorest set of families, right? They don't want the Shiites from the south coming up. They think they're just rabble, right? They think we're sophisticated, right? And then you've got actual Shiites to the west of Baghdad, going near what you guys call the Sunni Triangle, right? Where 2 American soldiers went missing, and it's a big thing.
What?
Yeah.
Oh my God, 2?
Being a Shiite and having to go through that was unbloody believable. Yeah. That was the good days. Woo! Yay! So they were... Okay, listen. Okay, God bless these guys, right? They were literally butchering dead Shiite bodies. Like, that's how crazy they were.
Yeah.
It's like, but they're dead.
Yeah.
It's like, no, but fuck them. Those were those were like you were on a car that was 30 years old, and somehow the driver got you up to 110 miles an hour, and he's giving it one of these, he's going through all the religions. Yeah. Anyway.
That was Hyder made the sign of the cross for those who are not in the room with us.
Yeah.
Which is everybody but 3 people.
Yeah. Okay. So then you got the next story of sectarianism, right? The sectarian story really starts like with the Shiite groups that are in Iran, right? They want control of the state.
Yeah.
Right. So the first thing is you've got the Hakims, you've got Hizb Da'wah. Hakim then otherwise used to be known as Skiri, but they keep changing their names and they fell apart during the ISIS phase. And the Sadrists were this nascent movement taking place in Iraq that nobody was talking about. We only really find out about them in 2003 when, God bless them, quite frankly, they kill Majid al-Khouti, right? Yes. So the CIA this guy was working with Tony Blair and George Bush. But when you start a foundation, you're already dead to me, right? Yeah. Right. So he started this
NGO immediately dead.
Started this foundation, and the guy they were literally selling. They were the guys in London selling the stolen artifacts, like from Babylon.
Yeah.
I mean, I was there for it. I mean, people can tell. I saw it with my own darn eyes. And academics tell me you're crazy. I know it. But anyway, that's another issue, right?
Sure.
So he comes in. The Americans are like, he's going to be the guy who's going to control the Shiites. He's as Western as they come. He is desperate for money. He used to drive around in a Bentley, a $200,000 Bentley, £200,000 Bentley, right? And every time I say that, all the academics are, well, so he was a businessman.
Yikes.
Anyway, whatever. So, but the beautiful thing about this is he goes to Najaf. As soon as the invasion happens, they drop him in Najaf. They give him an iMarsat phone, right, with several $100,000 cash and a gun, right? Anyway,
sounds very American.
Within 3 days, he's dead. This was the guy
Holy
they had.
Shit.
This was the guy they had hitched a lot of their plans to, and the son was like, and probably it was under the aegis of some Iranian element wanted him gone, because Khoury was very critical of the Iranians because he was pro-Western, right?
Yeah, of course.
So that
are you telling me that a CIA plant was?
Well, I know, but again,
against Iran.
No, the only reason I tell you this story is because again, you can go to foreign policy; they talk about it. I mean, I only really talk about stuff that I know that some Western chap has written about, so I don't get considered some conspiracy in that. But the stuff I know that I don't want to say because I sound like a lunatic. But the stuff that I can like show you actual evidence for.
Sure.
So that failed very, very quickly. That guy they thought he was going to be a liberal Shiite, which for me is a horrible idea anyway. So he gets wiped out, and the Khoury, Okay, so very quickly, let me just do this. So the sectarian story goes through Iran, and then what the Shiites who are abroad, they're planning, they're like, the Shiites made a mistake in 1920. This is like the myth that all Iraqi Shiites live under. That when the British came in, they said to the Shiites, listen, we're going to give you control. They came in through the south. It was the South Iraqis who invited the British to come in to overthrow the Ottomans, right? But then in 1920 they started. They wanted to get rid of the British. So then the British like, screw you. We'll just give you power to the Sunnis, right? I'm giving you a really. This is what they'll say. I'm not saying this is what happened, right? It's a much more complicated. But there's this mythology about this war. But so ever since 1920, the Shiites are like, if we ever get another chance, we're never going to make this mistake ever again. The poor Sunnis don't think like this.
Yeah.
Most of them are...
Because they got it handed to them.
No, most of them are secular. Like, they work for the state. Yeah. They're technocrats.
But also, if they were like, here you go, here are the keys to the kingdom.
But it never worked like that. They never gave the keys to Sunnis. I mean, that's how the Shiites imagined it, right? They just gave it to the Sunnis, right? It didn't really work like that. And they didn't want a piece of it. I mean, and the religious leader of the Shiite world was like, we can't work with the British. So they learned that lesson. So what they did was, the whole thing was not how we're going to rebuild Iraq. They were literally running around in the 90s in London, getting contracts from Philips, Siemens, British Petroleum, and even the British BBC didn't even know what they were reporting. But in these panorama reports in the late 90s, they kept showing these figures that you all see now, sat with major oil companies working out deals. It was about cash. It was extractive.
Yeah.
They wanted to go in and take cash out. They felt like they were owed.
Sure.
Right? They were owed cash. So the Shiites, it was really about money. It was money, much more than power and control. Because once they get power, they steal and then they run away either to Iran, Lebanon, or they go back if they were British. So the Iraqis blame the Iraqis that lived in the West, especially, right, for this. Now the Sunnis, when it came down to 2003, they didn't have a leader because they weren't a unified group, right? Whereas the Shiites weren't a unified group, but these elites were mixing with the Western, Western politicians. They were selling them this story, and they were like, "Okay, you guys get control." So when the elections happen, the first elections happen, the Shiites all have Shiite groups, right? Now a Sunni can't put up a Sunni group because they're immediately called a Ba'athist, right, or sectarian, right? Right?
It sounds like Left Book.
So the only thing they had was a Ba'athist light. I always forget his name. He was the first prime minister, right? But he was a Shiite.
Yeah.
But he was the Sunni. He was the Sunni vote because he was secular. He was like a Ba'athist. By the way, very quickly, he was the guy whose wife Saddam sent in 1986 or 87. He sent a guy to kill him with a machete. He ended up murdering his wife, and he ended up being hit by
Saddam's wife.
No, Alawi.
Oh.
Alawi, just to tell you how often this was happening, the wife gets chopped up to pieces. He gets hit like 15, 16 times, but somehow survives. Spends 1.5 years in hospital. That's what it was like. I mean, but in the end, it turns out Saddam was right to try and kill him. But, you didn't know that at the time,
So what you're saying is that Saddam did nothing wrong?
Well, he did the right... It just retroactively turned out to be right, But anyway... Right, so you get the sectarianization story really is the one created by the West. Like, this is how we're going to devolve power, because they can't think in anything more complex than 2 or 3 Kurd, Sunni, Shiite. Like, what are you doing?
That's too many.
Yeah,
That's too many.
Yeah.
It's got to be one versus another.
It's got to be one versus another.
Yeah.
And that was a complete nightmare for Iraqis. That would start to explain what happens after 2003. So the sanctions in Iraq, in 1998, you get a second intifada, second uprising. And that's the first time you see this group, the Sadrists, right? And it's mainly Basra. Saddam executes about 200 people in one day. It's a small uprising.
In 03?
1998.
1998, okay.
This is like the first, and it's a UN report. It's a UNESCO report. The first time ever mentioned this group, it refers to these guys have an allegiance to Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. So it's the first time we hear about this group. It's in 2003 when the invasion happens. You have this mass Sadrist movement that nobody knew about, who was outside of Iraq, right? And when the 2003 invasion happened, you're talking about poverty, people are sick. I mean, dude, if you meet a 16-year-old Iraqi, when I first went in 2005, it's like a 40-year-old. It's like, dude, like, first of all, the body is hard, like of a man. 12-year-olds, bodies of men. They were carrying RPGs, machine guns. They were working for the Sadrists. You had to, like, suck up to 12-year-olds because they were armed to the nutsacks, right? We were terrified of them. You just had to keep quiet. Like, and then, I'll wrap it up with this story. This will bring it all together, right? This will bring tribalism. This will bring the rise of the Shiite militias. As soon as the invasion happens, Iraq is completely looted. Even like the steel barriers on the motorway are stolen. Bloody supporting walls, load-bearing walls on, buildings 10 stories, 15 stories high are stolen. Why are you stealing a load-bearing? How do you steal a load-bearing wall, right? But so I first experienced this when I first return to Iraq, and I'm obsessed with the souk, the market, right? I know it sounds like Oriental and what have you, but it's just fruit and vegetables and crap, and I love that stuff. It's not. And you bust balls with people. Like, listen, I want a kilo of apples. You know what they do? You know what these jerks do to you, right? They have the perfect apples right in front of you, and then they go below. I'm like, well, how can you go below? It's a store, right? And then they tie. It's a black bag, you can't see it, and they tie it in 3 knots, right? Right?
This sounds like capitalism.
It has nothing to do with the fruit that you see, right? Nothing, right? So I always
So
say...
what you're saying is that Iraqi merchants, like fruit-selling merchants at stalls, are like the perfect capitalists.
Yeah, they're beautiful.
Beautiful capitalism.
Oh, I love the hell out of them, right? So I always say to them, the first time I said, listen, I'm going to give you extra money, right? When you go downstairs, right, I don't want you to give me one which isn't rotten. They all have to be rotten. He's like, that's the first person who's ever said that. I said, listen, because you're going to screw me over, right? So I might as well pretend as if I want it, right? Right? So you become friends with them. You bust their balls and, like, you still get the bad fruit, but whatever. At least you're friends with them. Anyway, so you're walking in the market, and it's like 8, 9, 10-year-olds, which, by the way, nobody had ever seen before. 8, 9, 10-year-olds in the market, carrier bags, and the markets are crap. And there's no state. Nobody's organizing this. All of these guys are Sadrists. They put the picture of Sadr. Before, they used to put the picture of Saddam Hussein up, right? When you put this picture, you couldn't touch whoever that guy was.
Sure.
Because you'll immediately go, how dare you?
Yeah.
Okay. But instead, people said we went from 1 Saddam to 50 Saddams. So it was like, in one place it was Sadr, another place it was Hakim, yada, yada, yada. So these guys were mainly Sadrists. They had the pictures up of Sadr. So you couldn't really goof around with them about that stuff. I'm walking down, and this 10, 11-year-old so they move the goods through these like barges, these trolleys, right? Wooden trolleys, right? And these rusty metal things sticking out, right? And this little twat, 11-year-old, cuts my calf muscle in half.
Jesus.
And I'm like, first of all, I'm not going to an Iraqi hospital because you're just going to die. Like, you're going to get infected, and I don't want that. And I turn around to him and I go, Kelb ibn al-Kelb, which is like son of a bitch, right? Which, like, I'm a man. I'm a grown man. It's a kid. I'm allowed to call him. And then, all of a sudden, 2 policemen grab me and start kicking the crap out of me. And as they're kicking the crap out of me, they're insulting me. Your mother's a whore, this and that. And they're pulling me to the side. And I'm like, what is going on?
Yeah.
And then I go... and then somehow there's this melee around me, and they keep pulling me out, and they're kicking the crap out of me. And I'm like, submitted to this, because
what are you going to do?
I don't know what to do. Like, I was like, I left the West to come home, and this is home.
Yeah.
I was like, okay. And they pulled me to the side, and they were like, listen, you can thank us later. Oh, thank you for what? You tore my clothes. I'm bleeding. Thank you for what? He goes, dude, you understand? I just saved you from a tribal gathering. That's their job. Their job is to jam into you. You get angry.
Yeah.
And then like, Ijawaz alayya, he insulted me, which means it's a tribal get together, right?
Oh, wow. Okay.
So they were also driving. They were crashing cars into other people's cars. Especially
to get an insult out of you.
Well, as soon as they crash into you, go, no, you crashed into me.
Oh, okay.
And if you call them a liar, then the money goes up.
Sure.
And that's what life became. This gangsterization kind of became sort of tacked on to the tribal story as well. It was all about monetizing. How can we extract money from each other?
All right, so we are moving on. And the next segment is called Seeing Red, where we pick the most obnoxious hot takes from the dark caverns of the internet. And we read them out to everyone. And we get your response. And it's going to hurt. It's going to be sad. Might make you angry. We're going to take this from Brian Dean Wright on Twitter.
Oh.
Yeah, Twitter. Twitter.
Yikes.
Here we go. The Democratic Party is being used as a parasitic host. The culprit? Question mark. Democratic Socialists. The goal is to push the Dems base far left, stealing these radicalized voters to start a new socialist party. Sadly, it's working. My latest essay exposes the fraud.
Venmo me for my labor.
And I should point out that he has included a picture of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders at the bottom of his text. I mean, let's begin with the fact that the Democratic Socialists are not to the far left. And both of the people pictured here are social democrats and not democratic socialists. And that they are both working within the Democratic Party and not trying to form an independent party. I really want to read his essay. I am desperate to hear Brian Dean Wright's essay on how the Democratic Party is being used as a parasitic host.
Yikes!
This is literally, am I the only one with thoughts on this garbage?
Well, I mean, there was a chap who wrote an essay critiquing.
Was it Brian Dean Wright?
No,
it's a prolific essayist.
It's a guy in Manchester, England, and his whole point was that ultimately social democracy will inevitably lead to white men having to perform sexual acts on men of color.
Wow!
So
holy shit!
So this guy still seems to me to be quite
Reasonable.
Quite rational. Holy hell! That's the hottest take I've ever heard in my entire life.
He even names this figure.
Holy shit!
Yeah.
I don't even know what to say.
Yeah.
It's the wildest take.
No, he's a wild guy. Yeah, no, but I mean, it's. But what is interesting is the constant fear of anything from the left.
Yes,
It's staggering.
even the most like basic human rights level bullshit.
Yeah.
Like,
Look, go back to the Obama era with Rahm Emanuel. The only insults he ever laid were actually only on liberals. I mean, it's astounding the contempt that almost everybody has for the left. You know, who's in politics.
yeah,
It's
absolutely.
astounding because it's a threat. Look, it's very obvious. This country, when you go issue by issue by issue, is at least liberal, if not to the left, right? Mm-hmm. So it's terrifying. As soon as any of these policies come out, Trump was, when he was running for election, was saying a lot of the stuff that Bernie was saying, right?
Yeah, that's why a lot of Bernie voters voted for Trump.
Yeah. So they get you elected. Obama went left to get elected, but once he got in, they're popular as hell. These policies. That's why it's dangerous. There's no right-wing policy that anybody. I want to get pissed on by the rich. That's not something that people aspire to. Trickle down economics, you know.
Literally.
Yeah.
I think that's actually the Libertarian Party line. I want to get pissed on by the
There's
rich.
a reason there's a yellow in there.
Okay, all right. So the next one I've got here is from. It's also from Twitter. Dan Lamoth. Who the fuck cares? He's verified on Twitter though. Here we go.
Garbage. That's what that means.
Get ready. Get the fuck ready for this one because it's beautiful. The world is filled with interesting people. Period. Stop.
Sure.
Stop
We
on
live
your
in
Telegram.
A society.
We live in a society. Today, I met an Army Ranger who was about to deploy to Afghanistan for a 6th time. This time as a volunteer with a new advisor unit. Stop. Asked why he does it, he cited being a feminist as one of his reasons.
By going to another.
My God. And so, I know you like to shit on Edward Said like all the fucking time.
Yeah.
But this is Orientalism on a whole other level where you see Western values as being so superior that you're willing to go to war, volunteer to go to war for feminism.
Yeah.
You're gonna kill people for feminism. The fuck out of here. The fuck out of here. So, thank you so much for Hyder coming on to talk about a variety of issues. And I wanted to thank everyone listening, particularly our Patreon subscribers. Bless. We've got some suggested reading in the show notes, some things you can look into to understand the greater context, because as we have alluded to several times in this episode, the U.S. education system perhaps lacks nuance regarding Iraq. Anyway, don't forget to rate and review on your favorite podcast app. Like us on facebook.com/ProlesPod. Follow us on Twitter @ProlesPod. And donate patreon.com/ProlesPod. If you have any sort of topic idea you want to send us, go ahead and get on our email at prolespod@gmail.com. Thank you so much. Good evening.
I'm content to die for my beliefs. So cut off my head and make me a martyr. The people will always remember it. No. They will forget.
A man who walks with God can walk anywhere. Hence, I fear nothing. The point of guerrilla war is not to succeed. It's always been just to make the enemy bleed, depriving the soldiers of the peace of mind that they need. Bullets are hard to telegraph when they bob and they weave. The only way a guerrilla war can never be over is when the occupation can't afford more soldiers until they have to draft the last of you into the service, and you refuse because you don't see the purpose. The only way to counter the insurgents that are well equipped is to paint the people fighting for freedom as terrorists. Then find a faction looking for foreign investment, install them in power and murder any objections. You can't stop a revolution for breathing, so to beat them they offer people the illusion of freedom. But when you're done dreaming and wake up tortured for treason, then you can see them hiding behind the God they believe in. Deep in the trenches in the heart of a war, that's the place the martyr is born. Motherfucker, it's on during the night before the start of the dawn. That's the place the martyr is born. Motherfucker, it's on. Gunshots are raining in the heart of a storm. That's the place the martyr is born. Motherfucker, it's on. Guerrilla war when the army is gone. That's the place the martyr is born. Motherfucker, it's on. The purpose of life is a life with a purpose, so I'd rather die for a cause than live a life that is worthless. I don't need the circus or the day of national observance. I need you to think for you and stop being a servant. Pawns only move a square in the game that they're used in, and realize it too late, like the shooting of Huey Newton or Patrice Lumumba and Salvador Allende, slaughtered by the power-hungry branches of their own gente. Gandhi wasn't killed by Pakistani nationals, he was assassinated by a Hindu radical. And Che Guevara, rebel to a U.S. continent, was sold to the CIA by Bolivian communists. Wasn't Yitzhak Rabin murdered by a Zionist, and Anwar Sadat a victim of the same violence? Malcolm X was seen as a threat to the FBI, but to blast them they used Muslims from the NOI. Even the 35th president of the republic was murdered by factions of his own government. So now that it's proven that a soldier of revolution or head of an empire disguised in a constitution cannot escape the retribution or manipulation of the self-appointed rulers of the planet's corporations, so I'ma need every generation to put your hands up, cause you can only get them off your back when you stand up. Deep in the trenches in the heart of a war, that's the place the martyr is born. Motherfucker, it's on during the night before the start of the dawn. That's the place the martyr is born. Motherfucker, it's on. Gunshots are raining in the heart of a storm, that's the place the martyr is born. Motherfucker, it's on. Guerrilla war when the army is gone, that's the place the martyr is born. Motherfucker, it's on. I was a man blessed by God to survive some of the worst circumstances. I had many things. Beautiful woman I loved. A home, money. And I gave it all up.